why they should send their kids to the UK for a public school experience. What's the point? What's the point of going to a public school? Why? Why would you bother attending a public school? I still remember when I first got to the school, my next door neighbor was a guy from Saudi Arabia. And when I first met him, I was like, so how long have you been here? And he told me his answer was 3 generations. I was like, what the hell do you mean by that?
Yep.
I didn't believe him.
Gosh.
I don't know why, but I was so naive. I didn't believe him. I was like, Ali, you're bullshitting. This is my first day. Don't lie. And he took me to the roll call, the gathering hall, where all our names upon entry are carved onto wooden boards.
Wow, what a tradition.
That is quite a tradition.
That is great tradition.
And he showed me his name, obviously. I'll see his name. And he showed me his dad's name. Same surname. So I bet it's a very peculiar surname. So that's his dad. And then his granddad.
Gosh.
Entered in 1951, something like that. I think it was 1951. I was like, okay, gosh. Okay, so this is a very special episode. And we've had this idea, Sebastian, to do this for a while, but we came to this because Hiromi is not well, and we decided to speed this up. It's a side project. Many audience have been asking me to do an episode or 2 in English because they've always thought that I speak English quite well. And I'm a truly bilingual guy. I tend to think when it comes to formal matters in English because of my education.
Yep, your training and everything.
Yeah, but I also love Chinese. In fact, I love Mandarin. I grew up speaking a lot of Mandarin, and my mom is very much based in China.
Right.
So in a way, I'm trilingual because Cantonese and Mandarin, to me, are 2 different languages.
Definitely.
But yes, so I'm very privileged to be able to do this with Sebastian Leung tonight. So do introduce yourself, Seb, to our audience. Many of whom, by the way, would have come across you because you represented me a few years ago in a careless driving trial, which we lost, but we appealed and we are still waiting for the judgment. We'll say no more on that, but Seb, tell everyone about yourself.
No, thank you very much, Joe, for having me here tonight.
Yeah.
Like you said, we've been planning this for some time.
Quite some time, yeah.
Yeah, and it's good to finally put this show on the road.
Yeah. No, Seb, how old are you?
I'm going to be 30 this year.
You're 30 this year,
Yeah.
but that means you're 5 years below me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I graduated from uni in 2011, and you in 2016?
2018.
18.
Yeah.
Oh God. Right. So quite a bit later. So Sebastian is a young up and coming barrister in Hong Kong, but we are not going to talk about the law today. What we're going to talk about is our high school education, in particular, our boarding school public school days. I'm so sorry. Our conversation is very interesting because even though we had both been to public schools, and we do need to give a definition of what a public school means. Seb actually went to perhaps the most famous day school in the UK, and I went to one of the I'd say most famous, probably the second most famous boarding school in the UK. So yes, why don't we share with everyone in terms of our education background. You were born and bred in London.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the reason why I went to a day school instead of a boarding school, like a lot of the people from Hong Kong, was because I grew up in London.
Yeah.
And it was a very natural thing for me to do, to go to.
Whereabouts in London?
In central London, right in the heart of London.
Right in the heart?
Yeah.
Gosh, what? Westminster?
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Wow, you're a proper London boy.
I'm a proper London boy.
And your parents are from Hong Kong?
Yeah, so my parents are from Hong Kong, and they went to the UK,
Right.
and have jobs there,
Right.
had jobs there,
Right.
and after giving birth to me, they stayed there,
Right.
which is why I stayed there as well.
Right.
And I only moved back here after completing my public school education and
Right.
studying at university in
Wow.
the UK.
Wow. So you grew up all the way in central London. Wow. Right. Yeah. So it was kindergarten and stuff and prep school and then St. Paul's. Seb went to St. Paul's, and I think many people will be familiar with St. Paul's Co-Educational College in Hong Kong, quite close to where we are.
Yes.
St. Paul's College for boys in Saiwan. But I would argue that St. Paul's London, if anyone is not familiar in Hong Kong, is probably one of the most brainy and successful and famous schools, never mind public school, in the UK. What is your Oxbridge rate, Seb? Let's tell everyone up front. How many people are there each year in each year group?
There are 180 boys. It's an all-boys school, as is the case with most of these public schools. And there are 180 boys in a year. And we were told roughly when we were studying there that 2/3 of the students were sort of expected to get an interview at Oxbridge.
2/3.
Yep. Around 2/3 were expected to get an interview at
crazy.
Oxbridge, regardless of what subject.
But Seb, that is crazy. That is by far the highest rate. I mean, the only other school with a similar ratio would be, I suppose, Westminster School, which is
Westminster,
another
probably.
school in the heart of London.
Yep.
Even Eton, which is supposedly the most famous public school in the UK, would have a ratio of about 1/3.
Yep.
Which is really high, by the way.
Well, and I think the 1/3 ratio of Eton is probably about right, because we were told anyway, around 2/3 would get the interview, of which half of those converted it into places.
2/3 and a half, that's 1/3.
So it's 1/3, exactly
Yeah.
like so that's probably where the Eton figure also.
I bet yours is higher though. Just for everyone's benefit of doubt, Harrow's Oxbridge rates is actually really low. I mean, it was so low that I was actually disappointed by the time I got there, because in a good year, out of a year group of about 160 students, the maximum would be about 20 who receive offers, which is 1/8. 1/8 is actually quite low. It's like a state school low, really. And for anyone who doesn't know what public school means, it doesn't mean state school. So it doesn't mean that your fees would get paid by the government. It doesn't mean that you don't have to pay fees. The term public school came about because originally it was built for the local public. That is true.
Yes.
But because they're generally such old foundations, they became so good that people started to come knocking on a door and asking to pay the fees in order to be a student.
Well-known public schools, day schools, boarding schools in the UK are all schools with histories of probably 400, 500 years, at least 300 years probably.
Yeah, and there's actually a Victorian Act of Parliament which stated that a few of them, including St. Paul's, by the way, are officially named as a public school.
Right.
And I always tell parents who come to me asking which school they should send their kids to, that under the law, there are, strictly speaking, only about a dozen names which are definitely public schools under the law. Harrow, Eton, Winchester, Rugby, St. Paul's is actually one of the two, I think, only day schools belong to that group. And I always say that these are the first class names. But yeah, no, academically, your school is definitely the best in the country, which is why I think audience would be interested to know more about your experience. I still remember when I was 17, I was at Harrow, and I became the first ever student who got invited to sit for the entrance paper for the UK Mathematics Olympiad team. I was surprised that I was allowed to sit for the paper because I didn't have a British passport. But apparently, if you had spent 4 years in the UK education system, then you can be considered a local. So I became the first one. I asked for a school as famous and prominent as Harrow. How the hell am I the first one to sit for it? And my teacher was very frank about it. And it was like, it was a she. She was like, oh, because usually the brainiest students in this school came from London. And the brainiest in London usually go to St. Paul's. And I was like, oh, okay. So there's this sort of natural brain drain towards St. Paul's. So tell us about how academically bright generally your people are.
Yeah, I think one of the very sort of interesting things about the St. Paul's education I had, and I'm curious to hear it in comparison to the Harrow one, which you had, was while academically we were very strong, and there was a definite emphasis on academics.
Yeah,
it wasn't at the cost of other aspects such as extracurricular or sports or arts or theatre.
Oh, really?
You were actually encouraged to maintain your academic grades whilst also excelling in at least one other area.
Right.
Which, no offense to the viewers from other prestigious public schools out there, but for example, places like Winchester, for example, are known for their academics, but not perhaps
they're not allowed to play rugby.
They're not allowed to play. The emphasis on sports is a lot less. Music, yes, to a certain extent. But if I could sort of sum up the St. Paul's education outlook, it was achieve high grades and excellence, but at low effort.
Right. No, that is, by the way, the general public school ethos.
I think so, yeah.
We're going to go on to that. I like that point very much. But no, your Oxbridge rate would easily beat Winchester's.
Yeah, the Oxbridge rate is very high, and you will know from coming from a similar school, for certain subjects, public schools are unprecedented at getting people into Oxbridge. Yeah. Traditional subjects, languages, English literature, economics, history, PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, law, all those kind of subjects. Yeah, all of our kind of schools are really good at that. And sort of as an anecdote to this Oxford rate that we were talking about. So instead of, I'm not sure if I've shared this with you before, but before I decided to do law at university, I actually planned to do classics. Right. And so that classics would have been the study of ancient Greek, Latin, and ancient history. Yeah.
And ancient philosophy.
And philosophy, ancient philosophy, exactly. All things, and A-levels, I also actually had already taken Latin and ancient history. So it was a very natural progression for me. Yeah. And I had in mind a career in law later. Right. But I didn't want to, per se, study it for 3 years. I wanted to do something else that I was actually interested in, sort of academically, to be more stimulated. Although
if you had gone to Oxford to do classics, it would have been a 4-year course.
It would have been a 4-year course.
The only Bachelor of Arts degree that would require 4 years of work.
Yeah. But I remember at the time when I was deciding what subjects to apply for, I was told by the classics department at St. Paul's, the year that had just gone before me had, I think, 9 Oxbridge applicants, of which 6 or 7 were successful. Right. And they said, you've already taken 2 of the main classic subjects, which we will go on to this as well, but public school teaching is obviously at a very high standard. Yeah. And some of the things that you would study for A-level in these very niche subjects are sort of what you might do in the first term of university, or if not first and second terms. And they were basically saying, you know, you've already done these subjects to such a high level, and you could apply for Oxbridge, and we're not going to guarantee that you can get in, but last year, 6 out of 9 get a place, 9 out of 9 were interviewed. Yeah. You want to take that, right? Yeah. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really something worth thinking about. But for other reasons, perhaps not so relevant for today, I decided not to. Right. Last minute, actually, I decided not to pursue classics at university and do the law degree. Right. I'd actually already planned so far that I was going to apply for Oxbridge for classics that I'd even prepared writing the essays. You know, you have to write, you will remember, you have to write an essay before you apply for Oxbridge and read a certain couple of texts. I did that all over the summer. Right. before the final year, and then came back in September and decided last minute, actually, if I want to be a lawyer,
Right.
I'll do the law degree.
Well, you would have become a barrister one way or another. And if you were so determined to become a barrister, then you could have done a law degree as your first degree anyway.
Yeah.
Just to save yourself quite some time, because
Yeah,
I had to
completely.
waste. I didn't do law at university. I didn't want to become a lawyer, by the way. My mom told me that as long as you got into Oxford, I didn't give a shit
Very
what
Asian
you did
mentality.
afterwards. So I got into Oxford for mathematics, which is my favorite subject. I wasn't a numbers guy, by the way. I was really into logic. I'm not good at numbers, actually. I failed the entrance test for, was it Morgan Stanley or UBS, for their numerical test as an Oxford undergraduate, which is really
In
shameful.
mathematics.
In mathematics. Because I'm not a numbers guy. I'm an Olympiad guy.
Right.
I can really solve problems, geometry, logic.
And Maths Olympiad is not actually numerical.
It's not numerical. It's not to do with
problem-
numbers.
it's mathematical
I'm not
problem
any good
solving.
with calculation,
Yeah.
but logic, I was really good at that. So I got into Oxford for that. I did pure maths for 2 years. By the time I got into my third year, I realized that I wouldn't be able to even secure a 2-1, a second class upper division, if I didn't fulfill some of my credits elsewhere. So I switched to philosophy. And luckily, because of philosophy, which I wouldn't say I'm absolute top at, but was good enough at, secured a 2-1 in the end. My average was 60.1. I still remember. I met my ex-girlfriend on the day I discovered my degree result. And when I told her that I was so happy that I got a 2-1 for 60.1, which is the lowest, basically, for a second class upper division, she despised me because I sort of aimed so low. But anyway, that's another story. But no, in contrast, Harrow is not known academically in recent decades at all, which I didn't know, by the way. I always thought that for such a famous school, you'd be academically very, very competent. But the truth is, in my year, out of 160 students, we only had about a dozen who got into Oxbridge. That's an Oxbridge rate of lower than 10%. I was one of those, and I felt very sad because the school is considered to be very all-rounded, but really it consists of, at the risk of offending the school, but it's obviously a long time ago. I don't know how good it is these days. So we had students who really specialized in what they were good at. So we had music scholars, art scholars, sports scholars, and I was an academic scholar. And for students like me, people here might not know, I only got to Harrow when I was 16 for A-levels. I had been to provincial public school in Cambridgeshire for GCSEs. That's what you got for pre-A-levels when I was 14. And I actually probably had more fun there. But anyway, and certainly the Oxbridge rate is about the same, being that low anyway. But we were called imports when we entered at 16. And usually there were only three types, sorry. The academic type, the music type, who played the violin, the viola, and then the sports types, usually from Africa, for being good at cricket and
Or rugby or something.
Rugby and sports in general. And I was the academic type. And when I got in, the expectation on me was to do as many A-levels as possible. And I got 8 AS levels in mathematics, further mathematics, statistics, critical thinking, Chinese, obviously, economics, politics, and physics. Off timetable. I had to even complete physics off timetable just to make up the 8 subjects.
For those of you that don't know what doing 8S subjects is, it is crazy.
It's stupid.
It is ridiculous. Even as Joe says, coming from such an academic school such as mine, nobody did 8 subjects.
Yeah.
It was only ever 5 subjects at most. And even the brightest students, or those who were Spanish and Italian, they would only do maybe 6 or 7 because they could do Spanish and Italian outside of school because they spoke both at home fluently. But even us, we wouldn't do 8. So for Joe to do 8 is phenomenal.
Yeah, no, Harrow had a lot of extremes. I mean, a lot of us were considered extreme students in one way or another. And we, being the academic scholars, we were, unlike Eton, we wouldn't be wearing our gowns, walking about, but we were entitled on all the school reports, and officially would be, my name was Lam JC, open bracket, SCH dot, close bracket, scholar. And if you had no specification in terms of what kind of scholar you were, then you were the academic scholar, the proper scholar, as
Right.
we used to call it. And I was one of those, so I had to do many subjects. I didn't know why I had to, and I basically didn't get any, by the way, discounts for my school fees because I wasn't from poor background. But yeah. And then applying to Oxbridge was a natural progression. Chose my best subject, and I got in. My offer was only for 2 A levels, by the way, in mathematics and further mathematics, for God's sake. And that was that. So enough about our background.
Yep.
What I want to do here is actually to ask some difficult questions, because many parents actually come to me in my consultancy work asking why they should send their kids to the UK for a public school experience. And I think we should tackle that question head on, Seb.
Good
What
idea. From
would
2
be,
different
in your
perspectives.
view, what's the point? What's the point of going to a public school? If, let's say, we would get into Oxbridge or whatever good uni, or to do law from wherever, from international school in Hong Kong, from local school in Hong Kong.
Yep.
Why? Why would you bother attending a public school?
I think attending a public school is a very unique experience, which, as cliche as it sounds, only those who have been through it can really appreciate.
No, tell us. What's it like? What's it like being in St. Paul's?
You're surrounded every day by people who are so different from you. Culturally, you know, there are people of all different nationalities.
Right.
Out of the 180 boys, you know, there are those from Britain.
How big is the school?
The campus.
And student population, how many?
So St. Paul's is 180 boys in a year across 5 years.
Slightly bigger than us. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And then there's a junior school, St. Paul's Junior School, Collett Court, which is where I also went.
That's Siu Hock.
That's Silhawk, yeah, exactly. Which is another 5 years, and there are 80 boys there. So
Right.
the sort of understanding is that the 80 boys from the junior school progress to the senior school, and then they also take in 80 boys from other very good day schools across London, essentially poaching the talent.
Yeah.
And then they join, which is how you get around 160, 180
Right.
per year. So the student body, even in the senior school, St. Paul's, is basically 1,000.
All boys, by the
All
way.
boys.
I think the audience here should know that we both went to boys' schools.
All boys' schools.
However, there is St. Paul's girls.
There is a St. Paul's girls, and St. Paul's girls academically are even better than St. Paul's
But that's
boys.
like DGS and DBS in Hong Kong.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
probably just
But
girls are smarter
you
than boys.
belong to the same foundation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, the same.
Yeah.
But their campus was around a mile or 2 miles away from us.
too
So
far.
we actually were basically two separate entities,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
didn't do anything together.
yeah.
Except for the founding of our school day,
Yeah.
St. Paul. We went where we went to St. Paul's Cathedral to
Yeah.
celebrate. But other than that, nothing.
Yeah. What are the boys like? Are they all very nerdy, academic, or all-rounded, or, you know?
There were, out of 180 boys in a year, there were 180 types.
Right.
And that, I think, is one of the things which makes a public school education, at least the one that I had,
Yep.
so unique.
Yep.
You got the opportunity to interact with and meet so many different people that you wouldn't be able to at that age and in such a easy way. So you could meet people of all different nationalities. There were the Asians, you know, Chinese, Hong Kong.
It's like London.
It's basically London.
Basically, it's
It is
like
London.
London.
And because for those of you, again, who are perhaps not so familiar with London, London, I think, is still one of the most multicultural cities in the world because it has all the Asians, different kinds of Asians. It has people from America, North America. Obviously, still, despite Brexit, there is still a huge amount of Europeans there. And different kinds of Europeans. Russians also. Lots of Russians in London.
By the way, at one stage, Shanghai was like that.
Oh.
With all the foreign occupation stuff. But nowadays, London, yeah, for sure. There are more languages spoken in London than there are nations in the UN, in the United Nations. I'm sure that Singapore's would reflect that. But you don't have that many foreign students in the sense that, you know, people without British passports.
Yeah. So all
most of them would be, you know, ethnic minorities, maybe, but they are actually British.
Yeah. Out of the 180 boys per year, 160 would be local London day boys.
Wow, that's a really high rate.
Only maybe 20 would be overseas students who were boarders.
Yeah. At Harrow, about 25%, back in my days anyway, were from London. But I'd say about a quarter are foreigners.
Right.
And Harrow has a history of educating foreign leaders. Yeah, for sure.
I'm sure your school was also very multicultural and very diverse.
Very. And it prides itself on that.
Yeah.
We've always taken on a lot of foreign students. I still remember when I first got to the school, my next door neighbor was a guy from Saudi Arabia. And when I first met him, I was like, so how long have you been here? And he told me his answer was 3 generations. I was like, what the hell do you mean by that?
Yep.
And it's like, well, my dad was in this school, in this boarding house, and so was my granddad. I didn't believe him.
Gosh.
I don't know why, but I was so naive. I didn't believe him. I was like, Ali, you're bullshitting. This is my first day. Don't lie. And he took me to the roll call, the gathering hall, where all our names upon entry are carved onto wooden boards.
Wow, what a tradition.
That is quite a tradition.
That is great tradition.
And he showed me his name, obviously. I'll see his name. And then he showed me his dad's name. Same surname. So I bet it's a very peculiar surname. So that's his dad. And then his granddad.
Gosh.
Entered in 1951, something like that. I think it was 1951. I was like, okay, gosh. And that's the sort of Harrow tradition. They have generations of people who come from abroad, but really like that school. So yeah, but you obviously come from many different kinds of backgrounds, and you say that they're all different, very individualistic in a sense.
Yeah.
But were they generally considered to be the sort of gentle type, the bullying type? You know, what were they like? Sporty, whatever.
Even amongst all the different ethnic groups, you then got all the different personality types, which is sort of creating even more variations, essentially. Right. So you had the nerds, the really geeky boys who only went to the library and studied. They didn't have any interest in sports or music or art or whatever.
Yeah.
You had the sporty kids, sort of like what people now call jocks, I guess. They were only interested in playing sports, being very alpha male, very macho, going to house parties on the weekends, that sort of thing. All that sort of a behavior.
Yeah.
Then you got the kids who were sort of a little bit emo,
Right.
A bit negative, perhaps haven't really understood.
Yeah.
What kind of person they want to be, very depressed type. So you got those sort of negative personalities. You got those very loud ones who perhaps had difficult family backgrounds or didn't know where they fitted in such a big ecosystem.
Right.
I think ecosystem is a big part of the public school experience as well. And those boys then tended to be class clowns, bullies, bullied people. So then you got these, and then you got those who were somewhere in between. Some who were maybe academically all right, not the most bright. They might play a little bit of sports, but they might actually have a great interest in theatre, for example. So then there'd be a guy like that. And the really unique thing I thought about my education was you got to see all these different people, and it gave you two things. One was an appreciation that there are so many different types out there.
Right.
But also very importantly, is it also from very early on allowed you to find out where you sort of fitted in amongst all these different types.
Right.
Which I think was really, really useful for the future, especially when you go to university and there are even more personality types, or when you enter the workforce and you meet lots of different people.
No, your school sounds quite nice, Seb. I mean, Harrow's a rough place. We had 11 boarding houses. We then had a 12th after my time, but in my time, there were only 11 boarding houses, and each house had a very distinct character. It's a bit like Harry Potter, you know. You had Slytherin, you had Gryffindor. They were all different. And my house was considered the nut house, the house where Winston Churchill, Stanley Baldwin, the two UK prime ministers, and the first ever Indian prime minister, Joe Nehru, had been to. The biggest, the oldest, but also the most screwed up. The headmasters, the house right in the middle of the campus. We were considered nut house at the time. That house took in all the problematic kids who came from the most spoiled background.
Right.
So they were all the richest kids, Middle East, UK, everywhere, but they were the most spoiled sprats. And each house had a very different character. We did have two houses that were considered Slytherin, so pure blood, you know, all white and very, very racist. And, we had a house called West Acre, which is considered West Asia because of the Asian ratio. But the thing is, even though we had distinctive characters within each house and the culture, I always used to tell kids who went to Harrow that your experience at Harrow would be determined by which house you had been to. It'd be so different. It's a bit like Harry Potter. I'm sure you can understand. But then Harrow had this sort of overarching ethos that there's a certain ideal that you had to fit into, which is to be a leader.
I see.
You all wanted to be a leader. And therefore there's a certain ideal that you had to fit into. I don't think from what you shared, that's what existed in Singapore's, but at Harrow you had to fit in. You had to become a certain type. And I would call it the bullshit type, basically. You had to learn how to bullshit your way through. You had to be very, very talkative. And it's a very interesting thing that I appreciated. I had this, not debate, but discussion with a younger peer from the same school, and he then went on to Oxford as well. You and I both know who we are talking about. And I used to ask him, if you had to choose between going to Harrow and Oxford, but only one, which one would you choose? And I said I would choose Harrow any time. And he was like, why? Of course it's Oxford. But I said, Harrow shaped me into who I am, sort of character building. It really helped me become who I am. And what I liked about the experience at Harrow was that it forced you to become this type where you don't have to know a lot, don't have to be very smart, but you have to pretend. You have to fake it until you make it.
Yes.
Everyone was faking, but everyone was a professional grade actor. We were all so good. Initially, I was skeptical because I thought I could really learn my stuff and become truly good and know my stuff. But the school really taught you to forget about learning, learn about faking.
Yes.
And I know this sounds very negative, by the way, but it's actually a really important life skill.
I couldn't agree more.
I wonder if you had picked up the same thing in your public school.
Yeah.
Because I reckon it's a general public school thing. If you're a nerd, you learned your stuff and you passed all your exams, you got top grades, you won't be appreciated in such schools. It's always those who are sort of class clowns, people who faked their way to success, became captains of their sports teams, not because they're that good, but because they all pretended to be a leader and people believed in them. I like that. I picked that quality up ever since. And it's what Hiromi has been complaining to me about, which is that, hey, you know, you're not actually that good, but you always believe in yourself so much. You're also confident that you sort of inspire others. I like that very much.
I think one thing that you mentioned, how Harrow, the sort of general approach was for everybody to become a leader. So I don't think we had that. We had a different sort of approach where everybody was actually encouraged to be different.
Right.
In I know it's a very cliche sort of approach, but my school was quite perhaps idealistic in that sense, where everybody was encouraged to develop their own identity.
Yeah.
Whatever
Is it
way
quite
it might
lefty,
be.
by the way?
Yeah, a little.
For the audience, I mean, you might not know what left and right mean in Hong Kong, but you know, I reckon your school, because we are very conservative.
Yeah,
we're very much
and
on
most
the
of
right.
these sort of public schools are
yeah,
conservative leaning.
Yeah, we were all conservative voting.
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
But that's very interesting.
Yeah, but in terms of what you said about bullshitting and sort of faking it till you make it, that is definitely something that existed culturally in my school, and I don't think I appreciated this until the later years in St. Paul's, but it almost felt as if it was encouraged by the teachers.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you had that experience as well.
No, for sure. Yeah.
You were sort of encouraged to do what you had to do to survive, to pass, to get the grades, you know, to graduate, make class, whatever. But in a way that you didn't overexert yourself.
Yeah.
And in a way that didn't make you an outsider with your peer group.
Yeah, exactly. We were taught to fit in.
You were taught to fit in.
We were taught to learn how to take shortcuts.
Take shortcuts, definitely.
And how to be truly smart in their sort of definition.
Exactly.
You know? So much so that after I got into Oxford, I got to pair up with a guy from Eton for tutorials. And because we came from the same sort of background in teaching, we used to gang up before tutorials and basically forming this sort of conspiracy with each other, and both completing only half of our tasks and giving the same sort of excuses to our tutors for not completing it because of the difficulty and the amount of work involved whatsoever. So much so that we got discovered because it was only us who did that. We had to be separated.